Hello, I'm Dr. Herb Spasser, a dentist by profession, a dental educator. I was clinical professor at NYU, New York University College of Dentistry, and a wine educator as an avocation. I am a certified wine educator with the Society of Wine Educators and have been teaching wine classes both in New York, New Jersey, and now in Atlanta, Georgia since 1976. Long before it was really popular. My love for wine really began long ago when I was stationed for 2 years in Châteauroux, France, as a dental officer in the U.S. Air Force. I had the opportunity to visit Germany many times, and it was there that I grew to know and love German wines. These wines are delicate, charming, and elegant, and are the perfect for an aperitif, for a picnic, for a patio, or for Asian food, among others. To know German wines is really to love them. They are low in alcohol, and that makes them very popular. The alcohol level usually is somewhere between 8 and 11%, compared to some of the big blockbuster wines of 14 and 15%. Next. So we're going to speak about the wonderful wines of Germany, both visually and intellectually. Next. We could say it all began with the Romans, except that winemaking had been in Germany for 2,000 years. The Romans, however, when they came with the Roman legions, Trier was their northernmost outpost, and they really brought viticulture to the area. It was the Middle Ages that the Cistercian monasteries, the church, maintained viticulture throughout the Dark Ages, and they became the largest landholders in Germany. And they were that way until Napoleonic laws came, which divided the property equally among their heirs. Well, this was very, very nice, except that it created a lot of confusion. The result, there were many different owners of the same vineyard. So now you have to know the quality of the individual producer of the same vineyard. Next. There are 13 wine regions in Germany. The most popular, most well-known, and undoubtedly make the best wines are both the Mosel and the Rheingau. The last two, Sachsen and Saal-Unstrut, are the last two that became German regions. They were in East Germany. And after reunification in 1989, they became part of the entire German wine region. Next. If we have to say one thing about wine in general, but specifically about German wines, is balance. Next. And in the balance, we have the dry wines, and the balance will be between the fruit and alcohol and the acidity and the tannin. Acid in the white wine, tannin in the red wine. Must be balanced by the fruit and the alcohol. Too much on either side will have the wine out of balance, and they will not taste the way it's supposed to be. For example, you could have a great red wine. When it's young, it has too much tannin and will not offer everything that it has. It will be too bitter. So we wait for the tannin, aged, softened, back in balance. Sweet wine is the same thing. The sweetness must be balanced with acidity and tartness. The analogy I always use is a ripe grapefruit, where you can actually taste the tartness and the sweetness at the same time. People who do not like sweet wines very often have sweet sugar water because they don't have the acid to balance the wine. Next. This is really the whole ball game, because if you can understand this, you will understand everything really about how wine is made and why wine is different. Wine is an agricultural product. It is like a peach or a pear. And if a peach or a pear is unripened, it's hard, it's sour. As it ripens, the sugar content increases, it becomes sweeter. And it's the same with the grape. In order to make wine, you must have enough grape sugar, or in very bad years, added sugar, so that the yeast can now produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide blows off and you have still wine. Sparkling wine is made with a second fermentation where the carbon dioxide is captured in the wine, creating the bubbles. Next. We have here what happens when the grapes stay on the vine. And as the grapes stay on longer time, the sugar, which is the green line, will increase. However, the acid, the yellow line, will decrease. And we want somewhere between the two, the balance of the sugar and the acid. If it's left on the vine too long, you have too much sugar and not enough acid. The wine becomes, as we say, flabby. And it's also the acid that gives the wine its longevity. The acid is the backbone of the wine. Next. What will make a wine sweet? Well, naturally, there must be a degree of sugar in the grape. It's called Brix or Ursula. Ursula is the German measurement by chemist Dr. Urschel, and it is the sugar content in the grape juice, the must. The ripeness of the grape, we call it hang time, will increase the degree of sugar. And then, as we said, it will be the grape sugar plus the yeast that will give you the alcohol, the wine. In Germany, there are two different ways that they produce sweet wine. They will have the sweet juice, the grape sugar, the must, and then fermentation begins. They will stop fermentation, and then the remaining unsweetened the unfermented sweet juice is added back, and the alcohol is from 13 brought down to 9%. The second, which is a more controlled and managed easier, is the sweet juice fermented dry. And then they have unfermented sweet juice in reserve. They call it sweet reserve, just reserve. And they add that to the dry wine, and that will give it the sweetness that they want. And it winds up again with about 8%, 9% alcohol. Next. Here you can see what happens as the grapes stay on the vine. In Germany, with certain climatic conditions, the fungus, Botrytis cinerea, will affect the grapes. They have spores, spokes, that go into the grape. The water is evaporated, and these grapes start to shrivel. The finest Trocken beer and Auslese, these grapes shrivel to the size of grapes, and what remains is concentrated grape juice. Unbelievably sweet. The nose is honeyed apricots, and the taste is, they say, the nectar of the gods. Probably the longest living, live, and also the most expensive of all the German wines. Next. What makes Germany unique is that it is the northernmost vineyard that makes grape wines. It is 50 to 51 degrees north latitude, which is the equivalent to Newfoundland. The difference is that you have cool climates and warming breezes and the Gulf Stream that will mitigate some of this, but still it is a very cool climate. For anybody that doesn't believe in climate change, let them come to Germany. Because years ago, the grape vintages were maybe 3 out of 10. Today, they are 8 or 9 out of 10. The reason, because it is warming and the grapes can now ripen more easily. But the yields are low and they need a long growing season in order to ripen these grapes because of the climate. Next. The major grapes, 71.3% are white. So the majority of the grapes are white grapes. Red grapes only 28.7%. And by far the Riesling and the Müller-Thurgau are the major grapes of the white variety. Spätburgunder, also known as the Pinot Noir in the rest of the world, makes up 9% of the red varieties. Next. Riesling, I have always felt, is the overlooked white wine jewel. It makes a fabulous wine. And during the Middle Ages, it was the most productive and expensive wine in Europe, above Burgundy and even Bordeaux. Next. So they feel it, and I have felt that of all the grapes in Germany, the most noble is the Riesling, called the queen of the grapes. It does well even in stony soils and requires a minimum of moisture. It is frost resistant, which is very important, and they have a acidity level that gives the wine a racy freshness. It feels great on your palate and goes well because of the acidity with all these other foods. Next. The system of categories are now being done by the EU. But basically, there's a table wine, Tafelwein in German, which can come from anywhere in the country, basically, of the wine-producing regions. The Landwein is a little more specific, comes from certain regions, and then you get to quality wine. And the QBA can come from 11 different regions. But any of the above wines, if the wine does not reach enough sugar in the grape naturally, sugar, glucose can be added so that the yeasts can produce wine. But the final category, Qualitätswein mit Prädikat, quality wine with something special, by law cannot be sugared. It must be natural wine. Next. So we have the table wine, the land wine, the QBA, and then the Qualitätswein mit Prädikat. And under that category, there are many different areas of dryness or sweetness. It's starting with trocken, which means dry, and then halbtrocken, half dry, and then the Cabernet, Spätlese, Auslese, Beeren Auslese, Eiswein, and TBA, the Trocken Beeren Auslese. Next. So it really depends on the ripeness for the quality and for the category. Each of these categories increase in sweetness, increase in longevity, and increase in price. The Cabernet wine, when it was made by the monks in the Cistercian monasteries, they called it Cabernet because they would keep these wines in a cabinet at the monastery. Spätlese, a late picking, was an actual freakish thing that happened. In each category, at each village, in each region, there was a nobility or a prince that will determine when people would start to pick wine. And they were not allowed to harvest before they got the message. And then this one particular time, the prince gave this messenger, go out and tell them they can pick. Except on his route, he made a stop. He visited his girlfriend. And 2 weeks later, he went and delivered the message. By this time, the wines had stayed an extra 2 weeks, became a little riper, became a little sweeter, and they loved it. And that became known as the Spätlese, late picking. Next. So the designations of Trocken is below 9 grams per liter of residual sugar. Below is 0.9%. And below 1%, you cannot tell dryness or sugar. You cannot perceive sweetness if it's below 9%. Almost no wines are absolutely devoid of sugar. But if it's below 1% or 10 grams per liter, you cannot tell. Halbtrocken, semi-dry, now you've got 18 grams per liter. And then they have what they knew, classic. It's a dry style, and the acidity and balance with the residual sugar, and there's a minimum now of 12% because it is dry. And selection is a dry wine from an individual site. Thanks. Here we have the 13 regions of Germany. The northernmost, which was formerly East Germany, Saal-Unstrut on the upper right, Sachsen on the left, on the right, is on the Elbe River around Dresden, and then the rest was in West Germany. The main areas were the Rhine River, and the Rhine started in Switzerland and then came into Germany, and basically it is a north and south river. The only place that it changes course is in the Rheingau, which we'll discuss in a few moments. But you can see as the lowest, southernmost is Baden, and it is Baden that is right across from Alsace. Next. The Mosel Saar produces probably the most elegant and the most delicate of all the German wines. It starts at the town of Koblenz on the northern end, as you can see, and then it will end up near Trier. And along the way, it is unique in its snake appearance. And you can see how curvy these wines, the wine of the Mosel is. There are two tributaries. One is called the Mosel, the Saar, and one is called the Ruwer. Both are tributaries of the Mosel, but on the label, regardless of whether it comes from the Mosel, the Saar, or the Ruwer, it will always say Mosel Saar Ruwer on the label. Next. Here you see how it snakes through the valleys. These are all made by the old glaciers creating rivers and gorges. This favorite site of any vineyard is southeast, facing southeast, so they get the morning sun. This is especially true in Germany and in the Mosel. So that they have a southeast exposure, they get a reflection of the sun from the river, and they have slate covering the vineyards, which we'll soon see. But you can see how the river snakes through and the vineyards jump from one side to the other, all always trying to get that favorite southeastern exposure, or as close to it as possible. Next. And here you can see the bend of the river, the vineyards, very steep, from 600 to 800 feet, and at a great angle, very difficult to vinify. But you can see how the vineyards are on one side, and as it swings around, the vineyards become forests. Next. Just below the entrance of the Mosel River is a beautiful town called Cochem. And Cochem, next, has a beautiful Reichsburg castle above, and many of these castles, both here and on the Rhine, have been restored to either hotels or restaurants or both. And here the town, charming. Below, the castles were always built as fortifications because the Rhine River was always a great avenue of commerce, which we'll soon see. Next. One of the most popular of the German Mosel wines is Peaceport. And you can see the title, Peaceporter Goldtropfen, in the vineyards. And that vineyard is probably the most well-known of all the Peaceport wines, and probably the best wine too. Peaceporter Goldtropfen, Golden Drops. Next. One of the finest, arguably the best producer in the Mosel is J.J. Prum. And J.J. Prum was founded in 1911. And Manfred Prum is third generation, and now his children have been taking over. Here you have the name of the vineyard and the degree of sweetness. So Grach is the name of the town. So the wine, if it belongs to the town of Grach, becomes Gracher, just like if you're from New York, you're a New Yorker. And the vineyard is Himmelreich. The degree of sweetness is a Spätlese, and they give you the year it was harvested. Next. Here again, you see Grache Himmelreich sign in the vineyards, and this is a relatively new occurrence. They never had signs before, but they do here, and they tell you and show you exactly where those vineyards are. Next. Next to Grach is Valen, another very well-known town, and the Sonnenau vineyards, the Sundial, is one of the most famous on the Mosel. We had the great pleasure next of visiting in 1989, the year of reunification, and we visited Manfred Prum at his home, and then he took us up to the vineyards with a basket full of wine, and we had a wonderful wine tasting. He was named German Winemaker of the Year in 1956. And as I said before, he's a third generation. His children now will run the vineyard, J.J. Prum. Next. And from that vantage point where we were sipping the wine, you had a beautiful view going down the vineyards, across the Mosel into the town of Valen. And as you go around the bend on the left side, you have the vineyards of Grach and then the vineyards of Bernkastel. Next. And Bernkastel is probably one of the best known of all the towns on the Mosel. Next. Very typical, half-timbered buildings, the local church. Next. And above, the Landshut Castle and the town and vineyards below. Next. The town itself, Bernkastel, as many of the German towns, half-timber buildings, a town square usually with a fountain, as you see here, and they are just charming places to visit. Next. In Bernkastel, among the cobblestone streets, they have the narrowest building in the world. The entrance in the building is 6 feet wide. Next. One of the most famous of the wines in the Mosel is called Bernkastel Dr. And legend had it that in the Middle Ages, the bishops took pilgrimages to Rome. And this particular bishop arrived in Bernkastel deathly ill. And they gave him some of the local wine to drink, and he made a miraculous recovery. And from then on, this vineyard, this wine, was called Bernkastel Dr. Next. You see the slate covering of these vineyards, which makes it very difficult to gather the grapes and to harvest, because you start to slide, and it must be hand harvested. Next. We said before, the town of Trier was the northernmost Roman outpost. The legions were here, and there still remain many of the Roman artifacts, such as the Black Gate. This was the old entrance, and there also was an arena, still from the Roman times, in Trier. Next. The Rheingau is equally as famous as the Mosel. The wines are wonderful. They have a little more body, so that they are not quite as delicate as the wines of the Mosel. They were along the north bank of the Rhine River, between Hockheim and Lorchhausen. And they are protected by the Taunus Mountains, so the winter's a little mild and the summers are warmer, and grapes are fabulous. Next. The new classification system on the Rhine is Erste Gewachs, which means the first growths, and its designation started in 2000. And they try to equate that to France's Grand Cru vineyards. The grapes must be Riesling if it's white, or Spätburgunder if it's red. The vineyard yield is limited to 50 hectoliters per hectare. Why? Because they feel that a lower quantity will give you a higher quality. The harvesting must be done by hand. The fruit must pass an exacting sensory examination by each local vineyard and the towns where the vineyards are grown. The labels must indicate the name of the classified site, and they may be released only after September 1st of the next year. Next. Now here we have the uniqueness of the Rheingau, because remember we said north and south is the Rhine, except here it bends in the Rheingau and goes from east to west and then back up north again. And because of this, on the north side of the river, what do we have? The southeast exposure. The southeast exposure that makes it wonderful. Next. So you see the slope of the vineyards on the north side facing southeast, and the Rhine River. And the Rhine River here, as in ancient days, is still an important avenue of commerce. Next. And because, especially in the Middle Ages, it was the avenue of commerce, that is the reason why these castles, these fortifications, were built to protect from various unsavory characters. Next. A well-known vineyard, Schloss Schönbrunn, is in Hattenheim on the Rhine. Next. With a beautiful winery surrounded by the vineyards. Next. And 1985, the vineyard master was showing us the ripening grapes, ripening Rieslings. And he said that in order for a winery to claim greatness from the vineyards, you must be able to see the river. And sure enough, you look here and you can see the Rhine from these vineyards. Next. The Rhine, in Eltville, you've got Schloss Vollrads. It was built in the 13th century. And Schloss Vollrad and Schloss Johannesburg are like the Grand Crus in France. And they can have on the labels just the name of the Schloss, of the chateau, of the winery. Next. Close to Eberbach, part of the German Federation now, owned by the government. It was built in 1136. Monastery, Cistercian monks ran it and kept wine growing and wine production right through the Dark Ages. Next. The interior supposedly has some of the greatest acoustics of any church in the world. The Vienna Boys Choir often come here to do concerts. Next. In the Middle Rhine, you have some of the most vivid and picturesque vineyard areas along the Rhine. And here, this is Asmenhausen, again, giving you the name of the winery and the town below. Next. Castles above, the vineyards, and the town below. Again, these have been rehabilitated, restored, and many of them hotels and restaurants now. Next. Another of the lovely castles on the Rhine. This one on an island in the center of the river. Next. One of the most famous sites on the Middle Rhine is the Lorelei Rock. The Lorelei Rock was next, the area where the sirens would sing the song, and they would have the sailors crash into the rocks. The Lorelei Rocks. Next. In Geisenheim, in the Rheingau, is a wine research center. And it was founded in 1872, and it is a very important to this day. What do? They try to produce cold and frost-resistant grapes. They try to produce grapes that are resistant to viral diseases and pests. They try to produce grapes with increased productivity, but maintaining quality. And they improve the rootstock grafting. And we'll just show you how they can graft different rootstock within 10, 15 seconds. And then when they have a new stock, they will micro vinification to test the new varieties. If they're good, they will now clone them and produce them in bulk. If they are not good, if they're not happy with the new variety, they tear up the roots, start all over again. Next. The gentleman who was the head of the Geisenheim Research Center was Helmut Becker. This was 1985. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1990. But here behind him, you see the vineyards, the experimental vineyards, and the center of the research center itself. Next. This is the way they do the grafting. They have a machine, and this one happens to be the Omega graft, and they just put the grafts together, and within 10-15 seconds, they have a graft. Next. And these are the various cuts that can be made to create the graft. The one that they use is the one on the right, and it's called the Omega graft. Next. And here's Helmut in the fields where he has now planted and having the successful varieties that they have created. And these nurseries now will be the site of various winemakers coming and purchasing some of these new varieties to be planted in their vineyards. Next. We know that all juice is white, regardless of the color of the skin. All grape juice is white, except Helmut is showing us a grape that he calls Dunkelfelder, and it has red juice. It also had red stems, red leaves, and he said that when the Russians had come to visit him and they saw this, they were thrilled with it all being red. Next. The Rheinhessen is a larger region, and it is in the south of the Rhine and west of the Rhine, but it does not have the slopes. It has gentle rolling hills which produce ordinary wine, not basically as much Riesling. They use a lot of the other grapes. Next. So you can see the gentle rolling hills without any great angles or sunshine particular. Yes. In the 70s and the 80s, one of the biggest and most important of the German imports was a wine from the Hesse called Liebfraumilch. And the major player was named Blue Nun. It was owned by the Peter Sichel family, and the advertisements on the radio and television in those days were very clever because they asked you to bring a little Blue Nun home for dinner. You could see the bottling line, and they were able to make 30,000 bottles a day. Next. Here you have the area of Baden, which we said is right next to Alsace, across west of the river. It is the southernmost of all the areas. Next. It has a huge co-op. And in that co-op, next, they have fermentation tanks that hold 100,000 gallons, and they make a lot of wine there. They store it next in their warehouse, which is motorized, and just to watch these unmanned trolleys delivering all the wines to the proper storage area was amazing. Next. The big problem that German wines had was that it became so complicated that people did not want to buy it because they could not understand what they were reading. But German labels are probably the most specific birth certificates of the wine of any winemaking region. Next. Because sometimes they tell you too much. But here you will see the name of the town, Berncastel on the left, the Doctor Vineyard. They'll give you the year, they'll give you the level of sweetness, and then they give you an AP number. And the AP number tells you the location, the inspection station, and the last numbers of the years it was bottled. On the right, the eagle designates state-owned wineries, and they own a lot of wineries throughout the wine regions. This coming from the Rheingau, and it's from Rauenthal, so it's a Rauenthaler. The vineyard is Viking, and again, give you the rest of the terminology. Next. As we said, Napoleonic laws divided these vineyards equally among heirs. So over the years, there have been many, many different owners of the same vineyard. Different parcels of the vineyard are owned by different people. And many times these people sold their part to a company so that we have the name now of the owners in bold letters. So on the right, you've got Reinhardt. The one in the middle is Dr. Fisher. And then the one on the left, we've got the eagle. So it's government owned. But you can see the name of the vineyard is the same. Achfenner Bachstein. Achfenner Bachstein. Achfenner Bachstein. The levels of sweetness are different, but each one of these will produce the entire gamut of sweetness. On the bottom of the label on the right, you'll see it says Erzige Abfüllung, which means estate bottled. So that is another quality control. And they will show you all the time Qualitätswein mit Prädikat, and then give you the sweetness level. Today, the Germans realize that these can be very confusing. So they now are trying to simplify the labels on these wines just to give you, number one, the name of the producer, since it is so important to have a good producer. And different producers will have different qualities of the same grape, the same vineyard, the same wine, except for the winemaker. Remember, he is an artist, and he can create different palettes. So they will simplify it with the name of the producer, the region, and very often just the grape and the year. On the back labels, they will have all the fancy stuff. Next. So I thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I do. I live vicariously each time I do this because I do love the German areas. And fortunately, Viking has beautiful river cruises up the Rhine and the Mosel, and you can see all of these sites for yourself. Next. And so we end by, we drink to your health, and in many different languages, they have the same salute, German auf Wiedersehen, French à votre santé, Hebrew l'chaim. Thank you again and enjoy.